I love going out on the road. I love performing. This is what I was born to do. And even more than that, I know it's a calling.
And the morning we went in to deliver the twins is when they discovered that our son Aiden's heartbeat had stopped.
In that doubt, sometimes those thoughts aren't my own thoughts. Those are placed, there to stop you from achieving what you can achieve.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Profiles. I'm Brian Howard. We're here on the campus of Brigham Young University, Idaho, and joining me today is John Gonzalez. John, welcome.
Thank you.
We'll do the fist pump today
Okay.
in like of all the COVID going on. John is a former mission president. He has worked for the missionary department for the church, also for seminaries and institute, had a 25-year stint working with the CIA, which we'll see what you can tell us about that. We'll be without having to kill us, as the movie line goes, right? Also as an author, I wrote an interesting book that has to do with your family history, which we can talk about as well. So, John, I understand you're from Texas originally. Tell us a little bit about that, growing up in Texas. Where were you at in Texas?
Born and raised in El Paso, Texas, which is the members of the church there primarily are the nucleus, are those that came out of the colonies in Mexico when the Exodus years ago. And so there's a strong a group of members there, and today they have about 3 stakes, but that's where I was born and raised, and that's where I call home. Unfortunately, my wife does not want to retire and live there. I don't understand why, but that's home to me.
Yeah, the heat is always on down there. Well, she grew up in New Mexico, right?
She grew up in Farmington, New Mexico.
Okay, so both, I guess not too far apart, but tell a little bit about growing up. So you ended up going to BYU and you studied political science. What was your interest in that? What did you want to do?
Well, in political, I came to BYU prior to my mission as a young man to Mexico. Not really sure what I wanted to do, but then after returning from Mexico, I kind of said, I want to get in government. And I'd like to be involved in government. Didn't really know what direction I wanted to take. I kind of thought the world needed me and wanted me. And of course, when I graduated with a degree in political science, I went back to Washington, recognizing and realizing the world didn't need me. I knocked on 1 million doors. And then just by chance, someone recommended, why don't you go apply with the FBI and the CIA? And so I did, just so I could tell people I applied there, and the CIA showed interest. And one thing led to another, and I was hired by the CIA. And after 25 years of serving undercover, I retired and looked back on a wonderful career in government service.
Wow. Let's step back a little bit, because you grew up down in Texas, but you have ancestry that part of the colonies down in Mexico, and you served a mission down there. What was that experience like? Was it pretty comfortable because you already had kind of that background? Or?
Well, yes. Interestingly, my last name is Gonzalez, and many who are viewing this might see that I don't necessarily look like a Gonzalez. My roots, my grandfather, who was born and raised a Mexican, joined the church and then found himself in the colonies. And then he married my grandmother, who was a colonist. So that makes my father, in terms of blood, half Mexican. So I've always had a love of the Mexican people, but I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. And so when I was called on my mission, and I wanted to serve in Mexico because that's where my grandfather served. He was the first full-time Mexican missionary of the church.
Wow. That's cool.
And that's where my father served. And I ended up serving there, but I had to learn Spanish.
That's always the fun process, right?
But
Sounds great.
The culture, I was used to the culture because El Paso is a border town, and so it was not a big shock to me.
How did that experience as a missionary, say once you came back, you kind of had an idea of what you wanted to do. What was it about being a missionary that helped you decide, this is the direction I want to go?
Well, I can't really pinpoint anything in particular. I loved my mission president, Benjamin Parra, who was a Mexican national, and just adored him and looked up to him. And I don't know if he necessarily prompted me to go in one direction or the other, but he did prompt me in whatever I wanted to do, I could achieve it. All of the missionaries felt that. Set an objective, a goal, and then work hard to achieve it. And somewhere in there, it stuck in me, and I ended up going the government route.
Let's talk a little bit about the CIA. I understand, missionaries are hot prospects because they know languages and they have a reputation for being honest and integrity, keep secrets, I suppose. So how was that experience like? What can you tell us about your time at the CIA?
Well, interestingly, oftentimes people think that there's a lot of members of the church, and there are many members of the church, but not necessarily over an abundance. There are a lot of great people in the church. Interestingly, when I came on with the CIA, I assumed that the only good people were members of the church. And I found out there are wonderful people who are not members of the church. But because of the language, because of the experience of being overseas and adapting, there just tends to be a gravitation for the government to seek out those skills. So for the 25 years in the CIA, my particular career path was in security. And so I was involved in investigations, in keeping things quiet, sources and methods to make sure that our nation's secrets were kept quiet. That was my career. And so every 2 or 3 years, I had a different aspect of that. So I was, I may not look like it, but for 2 years, I was the personal protection for the director of the CIA.
Oh, wow. And
traveled the world with him with a group of 9 other men that we would rotate on. I did investigations. I led groups, led teams of investigators, and just any aspect of security, both physical, personal, information, computer security, I was involved in.
Wow. So yeah, if you were, personal protection, do you feel like in danger at some times? Or one of those where you feel like, wow, this is or interesting situation, I suppose?
There were interesting situations only because of something. I would be traveling. I traveled the world, and I would be traveling to certain countries with those on the ground knowing I was arriving.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes because of problems with schedules, I wouldn't arrive when they were expecting me, and I'd have to make my way to the embassy or make my way. And being an American in a foreign country, especially in certain areas where they are suspicious of U.S. citizens, it was a little dicey. But I never really felt my life in danger, except one time when I was in Central America where they put me on a helicopter to go to some mountainous areas. And the pilot, it was foggy, and the pilot started to descend, and I saw another helicopter that was all mangled and had been shot down, and that wasn't the place for him. He went back up, and I thought, maybe I don't want to be here. But that was perhaps the only time where I really felt in danger, but not necessarily like you see in the movies.
Sure. Well, I was thinking, I go home and I, talk to my wife and I say, oh, this happened. So I event. That could have been difficult, I guess, because there's some things, you can talk about some basics, but you're not a detail guy. It was a rough day at the office. Why? Well, it was just rough, kind of thing.
Right, and I couldn't share any details. My wife and family obviously knew I worked for the CIA, and but you couldn't go into details. And in our marriage, my wife didn't want to know the details.
Better off that way. Right. How did you meet your wife? How did you?
Well, actually, when I hired on with the CIA, I was in Washington, D.C., and single, kind of wanting to find someone, and I was able to arrange a transfer to Los Angeles, where I was assigned to their field office, and I met her in a singles ward.
Oh, wow.
And the rest is history, and I'm grateful for that, and hopefully she's grateful. I think she's grateful for that as well. But we met, married in the Salt Lake Temple, and it's just been wonderful ever since.
Oh, that's great. And tell me about the experience. You worked there with the CIA. At what point did you end up getting called as a mission president? Because that's always got to be an interesting experience, that phone call. And
well,
how do you do that?
Actually, how it happened. So I retired from the CIA and started my own business.
Okay.
And it was a consulting business, primarily involved in security consulting, providing security services. And I started gaining clients, high net worth clients. and then was building that company. I perhaps was in about 4 years, 5 years into that. We had about 65 employees at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I get a call out of the blue from the office of then Elder Oaks asking if I had time for an interview. And I was, it was completely out of the blue. Came home, told my wife, what is this all about? What have I done wrong? Elder Oaks is the attorney, and so I thought, is there something I've done that there's some legal concerns? And we had a video interview with him, and it was just marvelous. And that's when he was kind of exploring the possibility of us serving a mission. Mm. And then a short time thereafter, about a month later, we were called by President Monson to serve as mission president wife. And then I had to wind down the business.
Yeah,
I was able, it was a little difficult. I was able to have it keep going while we were on. I had a nephew that I had hired who was running it, and I eventually sold the company. But that was, from the time we were called in January until we went on our mission in July, I had to arrange everything, tell clients what I was doing. And so that was, but it was a wonderful opportunity. And like I say, completely out of the blue.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, a lot of us don't think if someone gets called to be a mission president, hurrah. But for you, like yourself, running your own business, there was a lot of details to take care of and, a lot to think about. Well, how am I going to do that, right? Do you ever in your mind even questions like, no, I'm going to do, and I got to figure out how I'm going to handle this?
Well, it was interesting because when President Oaks talked to us, he said something to the effect, now you may never get called again and don't feel bad. And I remember telling him, well, okay, I understand that, but I'm gearing up this business. If we are called, I better not gear up and start making commitments. And so he said he would get back to us if it were not going to happen.
Okay.
And so he never did, because it did happen. But there was a lot to wind down the business. I remember I'm a very good sleeper. On my mission as a young man, I slept through an earthquake. I'm a very good sleeper. But during this time leading up to our mission, we served in the California Fresno mission. I could not sleep because my mind was racing with 1,000 things to put together and trying to resolve before we could leave.
Which brings you to the point. Then you actually go and you get there. What was the experience like? Mission presidents for 3 years. I don't know how long it takes to kind of get into the groove of things, but what was that like for you and your wife?
Well, you're overwhelmed, and you're thinking of, how I'm going to conduct zone conferences. How am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? It's overwhelming. And, the stakes, we were in the Fresno, California area. There's 11 stakes. And so thinking, that's, 2 stake conferences every year. That's 22 stake conferences. Oh, wow. How are we going to manage that? Luckily, and perhaps by divine design, our predecessor was in the middle of it and just operating beautifully. And so we kind of just picked up where he left off, and we just had to learn, the nuances to try to keep moving. But that first year, you're humbled by the experience. You're just, I don't want to make any mistakes, and you're just trying to, get any bit of guidance that you can. You're on your knees a lot. You're on your knees. Yeah.
I imagine you make some pretty good connection with missionaries, and they probably keep in touch with you over time.
Yes, and that's been the sweetest thing. And our own children sometimes complain that we have more connection with them than our own children. But it's a sweet experience to have those relationships.
I'm sure there's always some adventures as a mission president. Any great memories of things that happened while you're a mission president that stand out to you?
Well, some of the great things that stand out are one experience that I know it's just sweet is when a mission president makes transfers and decides to move one missionary to the other. You don't get a Moroni experience. You just feel this is the right thing and you move forward. My predecessor had assigned a particular missionary to a particular location. And when we arrived, this is how the experience came to us. This missionary on a Thanksgiving day, without anything else knowing what to do, started knocking on doors with his companion, and knocked on the door of his sister,
Oh, wow.
who he had not seen in over 13 years, nor did he know where she lived, and the family didn't know
Wow.
where she lived. And the backstory to this is that she had married outside of the church. And at one point in their discussion, as she was feeling the promptings to coming back in the church, the husband said, you know, I'll join your church when your brother knocks on our door. Well,
Wow.
the brother knocked on the door, and he was baptized. And when you see him, the husband, you think he's been a member all his life. So the sweet experiences like that happen in the mission that just confirm to you that the Lord's behind this
Yeah,
work.
knows what's
He
going
knows
on.
exactly what's going on.
Well, you came back for a mission and ended up working with the church, seminaries and institutes, and then also with the missionary department. What were your responsibilities there? I think you were back in D.C., is that right?
Well, yes, when we left our mission, I had sold the company. And so seminaries and institutes had reached out to us and asked if I would come on board with seminaries and institutes to take the place of an individual who was retiring in Virginia. And so I was brought on board as a coordinator, worked with about 4 or 5 different stakes, working with the volunteer seminary teachers, going to their classes in the morning, and then teaching institute classes. I like to tell people I taught at American University Law School, because that implies that I'm a lawyer, but I taught institute at the American University, and that was fun, and then evening classes. So I did that for about 2 years, and then the missionary department called, reached out and said, would I be interested in coming on board with the missionary department? And after visiting with them and them having me kind of, I guess they tested me out and I tested them out, I said, this I would really love. And so I came on board with the missionary department, and we moved back to Salt Lake and have been here since about 2013.
So what were the responsibilities with the missionary department? What kind of things?
The role that I was hired to do with the missionary department is to work with newly called mission presidents prior to their service, just to kind of giving them an orientation, answering administrative questions, and trying to help them out of their focus, because you have 1,000 questions when you're called.
Oh, yeah.
And you get a box of materials, and you're just overwhelmed. And the missionary department reaches out and has a lot of resources that are helping newly called mission presidents and their wives to get prepared. So I was involved in that. And then once the mission president and his wife landed in the mission, about 3 months, 4 months after they arrived, they had their feet on the ground, then I would go to a mission, go out with missionaries, observe their teaching, observe how they find, sit down with the mission president and say, here's what I observed, here, what questions. He has a whole host of questions, and just kind of shared observations that helped him kind of fine-tune what he wanted to do to teach and direct his mission.
That sounds really cool, because I think when you serve as a missionary, you kind of envision everyone else's mission is kind of the same as yours, and then come to find out later on, not even close, right? So you've had the opportunity to go and not only be a mission president, serve as a missionary, but also observe all these other missions, and it's got to be interesting to kind of see how things are done differently, different cultures, different styles, and how they all work together.
I absolutely loved it. I've been to over 100 missions. Both in the U.S. and in Mexico, Central America, and there are many things that are just the same, and other things that it's a particular culture of that mission. And it's interesting. There are some things that every missionary does. I can be with a missionary, and we'll go into a discussion, or we'll be in the middle of a discussion, and in my mind I'll go, I know exactly where this is going. I know exactly where. I'll be with missionaries. I'll observe their planning in the morning, sit down and just listen to them. All I'm doing is observing. And in the first 5 seconds, I can tell them exactly, I know what they're going to be doing for the next 30 minutes. And so it allows for an opportunity for helping the mission president know how to fine tune his training for his missionaries to increase their skills in teaching, in finding in planning and everything. There's, I mean, just for example, one of the things that you see often are missionaries who get into the home teaching mode. And the home teaching mode is, you know, Brother Howard, we're in your home. Who would you like to pray? You know, and there's always this awkward moment as the Brother Howard doesn't, you know,
I don't know.
why don't you pray? You know, or at the end of the lesson, will you pray? And there's this awkward moment rather than missionaries kind of taking charge and saying, we're grateful to be here. We'd like to start with a prayer. Is it okay if my companion offered that? And listen to them, because at the end, we're going to invite you to pray. That type of approach. But it's interesting. Those type of experiences, you see it across the board.
Yeah, well, we've all been trained up from our home teaching experience and carried in the mission field, right? You just want to be respectful. That's funny.
Right.
Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. I do want to talk to you about the book that you wrote, because you gave me a copy and I went through it. I haven't read the whole thing, but amazing stories about your ancestry. What prompted you to want to do that?
Well, I think partially the spirit of Elijah. I have a great love for my family and my heritage. And I grew up with hearing a lot of stories. And so, and my parents, my father wrote an autobiography. My mother wrote her life story, because in the church, as we are raised in the church, we were focused on that. And so I just wanted to put this all in a volume for basically my children and my descendants to capture these stories and the memories. And I had someone help me do some research, help me in the writing, help me to put it together so that it wasn't just Mom did this and Uncle Joe did this. I wanted to write it in a way that if you were not a member of the church, or if you didn't know any members of the family, that you could connect. And then I share the experiences. I share the experiences of my grandfather as a missionary, who is captured with his companion, thinking that the government forces thinking that they're terrorists and revolutionaries. And then him turning that around and having an audience with the president of Mexico. And different stories of that, stories about my father and miracles of blessings, of priesthood blessings, of him having restoration of health. Those types of stories which build faith and increase love for family and love for the gospel, which enriches all of our lives.
Well, as I was thumbing through it, that's what I liked about it. I didn't know what to expect. And then as I go through, it's like, these are great stories. And I think anyone can connect with the stories, which makes it fun, because it's not only great for you, your family, and your posterity and whatnot, but anyone could pick it up. But as I look through it, it represents a lot of work. When how did you work on this over time?
Well, when we returned from our mission, in 2011, that's when I started focus on it. I had a lot of the materials, and I had interviews that I had conducted with my own father and other relatives that I just had. And so a good friend of mine, an author, Del Van Atta, who incidentally wrote the book, the biography on Bill Marriott. He was a good friend, and he helped guide me and direct me, and even went on some interviews with me to help me capture the information. It was just it was in spurts, because I'd focus on it, hyper OCD, and then you get involved in work or church work and then put it down, then you'd ramp up. And then my wife kind of said, we need to finish this so we can give it as a gift for Christmas. So she prompted the focus to finally
get the thing done.
Finalize it and get it in print form.
I'll tell you, the name of the book is No More Strangers and Foreigners, Melding of Cultures Against the Backdrop of Deep Religious Faith. A lot of fun to read, even if they, again, don't have to be a relative. Some great stories, especially about the colonies of the church down in Mexico, and some of the missionary stories down there. Do you have, you already told a great story. Do you have a favorite from all the stories?
Well, one of my favorites, there's a hymn in the Spanish hymnal that is beloved by many members of the church, called Placenteros nos es trabajar. It used to be called La Despedida, the farewell, or the translation, it's just joyous to be involved in the work. And you usually hear this hymn at missionary farewells. You might hear it at a funeral. But it's if you talk to a lot of missionaries, they'll say, oh, I love that hymn. Well, the story behind that hymn is my grandfather, as a missionary with his companion, are trying to gain converts, trying to find people to teach. My great-grandfather, his father, was a Protestant. My great-grandmother was devoutly Catholic. But my grandfather had the experience of having, Protestant experiences in the home, and he was familiar with a hymn called "In the Sweet By and By," which you will see in a Presbyterian church. You'll see it in their hymnal. And so these two missionaries decide to sing that hymn on a street corner. Some other ministers or members of other churches didn't like, number one, that the missionaries of the church were there. Mm-hmm. And some of these ministers came up to him and said, hey, that's our hymn, you can't sing it. And there was kind of this, what do you mean we can't sing it? Sure, we can sing it. Well, there was kind of a problem that was raised. The authorities were brought in, and my grandfather and his companion, believe it or not, for singing a hymn that's not theirs, are put in jail. And this, of course, is at a time when you're put in jail, you don't know if you'll ever see the person again. Well, that night, my grandfather pins new words to the hymn. Mm. And so the next day, as they're trying to sort this out, my grandfather's saying, this is our hymn. And so, of course, they're released from jail, and that hymn now is part of the Mexican hymnal.
Wow.
And the sweet little thing about that is when my grandfather served his mission, he was married and left on his mission. In fact, when he got the call from Box B in Salt Lake, he had a little business, had a newborn son, and he says, I can't serve this mission. I've got responsibilities, got a family. And my grandmother said, no, you'll go do it because we will be blessed. Mm. Like Nephi, I will go and I will serve. And he did. And the sad thing is during his mission, that little baby died. Uh-huh. And when you sing the hymn, Placenteros nos es trabajar, part of it for me is his thought process of losing that baby. You feel that, for me, you feel that in that hymn. Mm.
John, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Encourage people to read those stories. They're fantastic. And it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thanks you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.